Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. So, if you've glanced at the news, well, literally anytime recently, you've probably felt this deep, overwhelming sense of frustration with government gridlock, right? We see the endless arguing, the stalled bills. It just kind of feels like our legislative branch isn't really getting anything done. And look, it's completely validating to acknowledge that frustration. But today, we're going to look past the symptoms and ask a much more provocative question. Why is Congress actually so weak? Like, what's fundamentally broken right beneath the surface?
To answer that, we're exploring an absolutely fantastic piece of analysis by Sorrell W. Gaynor. It's titled Reinforcing Article 1 with Institutional Investments. Together, we're going to uncover the hidden structural mechanics of Congress. We'll see exactly how the gears of our government have basically been grinding to a halt. And, more importantly, we'll look at how the author suggests we can actually fix them.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for systematically breaking down this whole complex topic. First, we'll look at the imbalance of power. 2, the capacity crisis. 3, the rise of party leaders. And finally, rebuilding the first branch. Section 1, the imbalance of power. The constitutional design versus modern reality. So, the great American experiment of 3 perfectly balanced branches of government, well, it's shifted pretty dramatically over time. Over the past century, the federal government has expanded immensely in size. But, as Gaynor points out, most of that growth has been housed squarely in the executive branch. Today, the president and the massive bureaucracy control vast regulatory powers. And this often completely circumvents the essential function of Congress, which, is lawmaking. On the flip side, we have a Supreme Court that's become increasingly proactive, further sidelining Congress's representative authority. So Congress is essentially squeezed right in the middle, between an incredibly powerful executive and a highly tactical judiciary, and they're just struggling to fulfill their constitutional role to balance them out. Now, when we try to figure out why Congress is getting squeezed like this, we run into a really common myth. The myth is that congressional weakness is simply a result of biased leaders, extreme partisan polarization, or, politicians who just want to grandstand on social media. And sure, those things definitely exist, no doubt about it. But the author argues that we need to peel back the onion here. If we look beneath the surface of those big picture problems, we actually find the real root cause of congressional dysfunction. Section 2, the capacity crisis. Peeling back the layers of gridlock. So the core argument of our source material is that Congress isn't just polarized, it's literally starved of resources. It fundamentally lacks the capacity to do its job, and this crucial point is captured by one shockingly low number: 2. That represents the average tenure in years for a congressional staffer. Because Congress faces far more complex policy problems and way larger constituencies than ever before, their workload is just immense. Yet they are vastly understaffed compared to the executive branch, which leads to pervasive, really severe turnover. These staffers are burning out and just leaving the Hill in less than 2 years. And this crisis builds to another glaring number: 20. It has been almost 20 years since Congress has had a meaningful pay raise. Think about that. And when you actually account for inflation over the past 2 decades, their operational pay has significantly decreased. You just can't expect to retain top-tier talent to manage this unwieldy federal bureaucracy when the compensation is actively shrinking over time.
And then there's perhaps the most staggering constraint of them all: 18. This is the hard cap on full-time staff for House rank-and-file offices. What's truly wild about this number is that it has been completely frozen since 1975. I mean, just think about how much the country has grown since 1975. These same 18 staffers are now responsible for representing districts that have swelled to nearly 800,000 people. The budgets and the staff sizes have stayed exactly the same, while the population has become so much larger and far more diverse.
So when you combine that low pay, those frozen staff caps, and the massive turnover, you lose something absolutely critical: institutional knowledge. This is the collective experience and procedural know-how that simply walks right out the door when overwhelmed staff finally leave. Gaynor explains that this specific capacity crisis directly leads to a massive decline in performance. Legislating becomes way less responsive. Congressional investigations lose their bite entirely because the manpower just isn't there. And constituent relations really suffer because staffers simply do not have the time, the resources, or the experience to meet the moment. Section 3. Rise of party leaders, the centralization of congressional power. All right, so as rank-and-file offices grew weaker and lost all these resources, the internal mechanics of Congress shifted drastically. To understand how we got here, we really have to look at this historical timeline. Prior to 1995, power and information were pretty well distributed across various committees. But in 1995, a major shift in institutional design took place. Then Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich intentionally defunded or eliminated alternative sources of power. This meant cutting committee staff, cutting congressional caucuses staff, and slashing support agencies like the Congressional Research Service. By removing those resources, information and power were mechanically centralized right into the hands of party leaders. And today, well, that dynamic has only become more entrenched.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast it creates in today's Congress. On one side, you have the rank-and-file members. Even the most ambitious among them are left highly reliant on party leaders, and they're largely severed from meaningful constituent policymaking. On the other side, you have party leadership. Over time, they've successfully secured higher staff capacities, extra budgets for party-led activities, and the ultimate ability to dictate procedure. It creates an immense disparity in resources that effectively bottlenecks true localized representation.
The ultimate consequence of all this centralization is how Congress actually produces laws today. Instead of individual, well-debated laws, we get these immensely complex omnibus bills. These massive packages are managed entirely by party leaders, just to force bipartisan coalitions. And while the author notes this outcome is certainly better than total gridlock, these bills are largely devoid of any real rank-and-file input. It forces Congress to be permanently on the defensive, stalling nominations or just barely keeping the government funded at the last minute, rather than proactively solving real problems.
Section 4, Rebuilding the First Branch, Equipping Congress to do its job.
So, how do we actually fix this? Well, the source text lays out practical solutions that focus heavily on institutional investments to restore the balance, and it requires 3 primary steps. Step 1. Congress absolutely must actively invest in itself and its people through the Legislative Branch Appropriations Act. Step 2. They need to allocate those resources in a way that strategically decentralizes power, moving it back away from just leadership. And step 3, these resources have to be decoupled from partisan control to really reinforce long-term institutional stability. Let's get specific on what those investments actually look like in practice. To support high-quality staff retention and empower the rank and file, the author suggests equal committee staff ratios, regardless of which party is actually in the majority. Congress also needs consistent, competitive cost of living adjustments, just like the rest of the federal government gets. Plus, any expansions in leadership resources should automatically be mirrored for rank-and-file members. And finally, Congress must create alternative sources of information by subsidizing caucuses and properly funding critical support agencies, like the Congressional Research Service and the Government Accountability Office.
But to achieve this purposeful reform, it requires one very key and tangible ingredient from lawmakers: bravery. Rank-and-file members have to overcome this fear that voting for a pay raise or increasing their own budgets is going to hurt them in their next election. The author actually points out that this is an unfounded and incredibly costly apprehension. Lawmakers genuinely need the courage to invest in their own policy staff and operational budgets, so they can actually rely on one another for information, rather than depending solely on party leaders to tell them what to do.
I want to leave you with this powerful metaphor straight from the author. For Congress to fight back, it needs fighters and boxing gloves to stay in the match. Think about it. If we demand that Congress control a massive federal bureaucracy and balance a very powerful executive branch, we have to actually equip them to do so. So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. Can our democracy really afford to keep sending Congress into the ring with its hands tied behind its back? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the mechanics of how our world works.